So, over the past year and a half, I've been trying to teach myself how to draw digitally. And as someone who used to hate drawing digitally and pretty much only ever did traditional art, I quickly realized that this was going to be a pretty big challenge to try and adapt to a digital toolkit. So, of course, like anyone trying to learn, I searched the internet for people who draw digitally in their career and, other just artists on social media and stuff like that. But Kan Liu was really the one who stood out to me the most because his style and techniques translate really well to traditional painting. And, he works in the industry. He's an illustration artist at Riot Games for Legends of Runeterra. So I saw that as a huge plus learning from someone who actually works in the industry. I was subscribed to his Patreon for over a year and have seen all of his tutorial videos and all of his unedited painting recordings. So I've been looking at this guy's stuff for quite a while now. And I also would recommend subscribing to Khan's Patreon if he ever opens it up again. I'm pretty sure he's taking a break right now, but his Patreon is better than some of the college classes I've had. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that if he ever opens it again. I'll throw the links in the description. So I have some of his original Photoshop files that I can open, and these are the best to look at because you don't get any compression. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single element that I think is great because this video would be like 5 hours long. So yeah, we're not doing that. But I will say that I think the most impressive thing about his paintings are when you zoom in, basically nothing is blended at all. Or at least I would say a majority of his stuff is not really blended. He typically does do some blending towards the end of a process, but it's very minimal and it's usually very, very strategically done. I think this is one of the reasons why I was so drawn to studying this guy because I had a teacher in high school that he would constantly tell me like don't like stop blending, just don't blend anything. And it's super difficult, especially when you're younger and like when I was in school and stuff, I was always just trying to, make some giant realistic cat head or something and it's just like, well, it's not going to look real if it's not blended or whatever, but as you progress farther in your art journey, you learn more and more and you realize that you really don't need to blend like anything to actually create something that looks realistic. So to see some guy do it on like this scale to like this extreme, like his whole style is basically about it, was really impressive. And of course, you'll notice that in my speed paint or whatever in the background, I'll probably go against basically everything I'm saying in this video and I'll be blending like crazy and there will be like no planning at all. So, still still in that art journey. Another thing about Khan's artwork is he uses like this very selective range of values. They're super high contrast graphic type images, and he does this by just using, the lowest end of the value scale, the darkest darks, and then the highest end of the value scale, the brightest brights. So this in combination with very selectively blending stuff is how he's able to achieve these really bold graphic type illustrations. That being said, there are still midtones, but in a lot of cases, like the the values, like the dark end of the value spectrum, or whatever you want to call it, is so well used with the light values that you almost like don't even really notice the midtones. Like it's kind of hard to describe what I'm saying, but it almost creates like this paper cutout effect. And yeah, the whole thing is just very impressive, I think. So this whole idea of, using the brightest brights and the darkest darks and not blending, all this stuff, creating like this graphic style composition all comes into my biggest takeaway from studying Kan, which is the importance of shape language. It's something that I definitely overlooked for years in my own artwork, even working traditionally. When I talk about shape language, I'm not talking about the overall composition. Shape language is a key building block in the composition, but not the composition itself. I think a lot of times when people think about shape language, they think of like that concept art thing, like, oh, triangles are scary, circles are friendly or whatever. I don't even remember what it is, but I think that's what pretty much a lot of people think about when they hear shape language. But really in illustration, shape language, it kind of has like this macro micro scale where, the most obvious shape language is the silhouettes of things like the character and buildings, and that's kind of like the building block that builds the entire composition. And of course, you have the inverted version of that, which in this case is the sky or the negative space. Those things are going to also create shapes, and then you have the micro scale, which is essentially how the value range breaks up the larger shapes. So in this case, of course, with con stuff, it's those bright brights and dark darks, and how those are going to divide the bigger shapes. So how do we actually practice this? How do we use it? Why is it important? Blah blah blah. I think the easiest way to really start practicing good shape language is in the very beginning of when you start a new illustration. You really want to spend a lot of time planning the pose of the character. And I think a lot of people overlook this, especially new or beginner artists. From the very beginning of an illustration, you really need to start thinking about how can I make the pose of the character as interesting as possible, and how is it going to lead the viewer's eye across the image? Where is the light going to be coming from that creates those micro shapes that also add into the composition? This is something that Khan spends a lot of time doing. If you look at like a lot of his stuff on social media, he has like these black and white sketches of characters and things like that. And in a lot of cases, that's how he starts some of these bigger illustrations. He spends a lot of time just thinking about an interesting pose for the viewer. For example, too, to I guess explain this a little bit better, is there's 1,000 ways that you can draw somebody jumping, but only a handful of those are really going to be actually like visibly legible. Some of that, like, depending on how you draw someone jumping, like, you might not be able to understand it at all. And then the micro scale, the lighting on top of that is going to be a whole nother thing too. Like, so there really is a lot to think about while posing a character. And then you also have the other Z scale, basically, where you can create depth and use foreshortening, which is going to make the pose even more interesting. It's definitely more difficult than the overall silhouette of a character pose, but it is another way. And with good foreshortening and good lighting, you can really make the image a lot more interesting depending on how you place everything. But I would say overall, when you're trying to pose a character, it's probably better to just focus on the overall silhouette, especially in the beginning, because you really just want to have a good shape that's interesting. I would say that, I would spend a lot of time trying to find that shape. And then once you find that shape, or you think you find that shape, I would spend even more time looking at that shape and trying to make it even better. And just constantly ask yourself the question, how can I make this shape more interesting? Because there probably is a way to make it more interesting. So yeah, I think character the character pose is the easiest way to really understand this concept, but this also applies to everything in the image from, the farthest things away in the background to all the way in the foreground, the closest things, pretty much everything. You have to be thinking about that overall shape. Another thing that I think a lot of people overlook, and it's something that I was definitely overlooking for a long time, but I really noticed it with Khan's work, is adding detail into these shapes after you find the shapes. So, for example, once after you spend a lot of time planning the shapes out, go back to the shapes and then almost on like this micro level, make them more interesting because it is possible there you can just keep making these shapes more interesting. So for example, like if I draw this hand here, it looks interesting enough, I would say, and I think a lot of people would just, they would leave this hand like this, but obviously you can take this a step further, like this example where I've made it more detailed on this micro scale. And if you look at Khan's work, you'll notice this like micro level of detail in the edges of almost all of the shapes in the entire image. I truly believe that like this skill alone of making these detailed edges can seriously improve your art. Just this alone. It's that important. And you got to remember here that I'm just talking about the edges of the shape. I'm not talking about, the coloring or the values or whatever inside of the shape. I'm talking about the detail in the edges of the shape. So for example, if you look at this temple in the background here, most of the detail is being created by this outside edge, and it's a good example because the way he creates this like intricate outside edge doesn't really it's he's basically just making things up for the sake of the composition. Like we don't know what these hanging things are. It's the inside of the shape is just it's all the same value pretty much. It's just it looks detailed because of this outside edge and then the inside texture of the shape. But we don't know what this stuff is and it doesn't matter anyways, but it makes the composition so much more interesting the way it works with the sky and how it pieces all these other shapes together. And just look how this hanging thing on the temple is actually able to fully connect this triangular shape in the full composition. This is the entire goal of shape language. It's to create this rhythm throughout your entire image. And it just shows how you can create this like illusion of a complicated rendered object with basically doing like the bare minimum amount of rendering. So yeah, another way you could practice shape language without creating an entire illustration, like if you just wanted to try and bang out a bunch of um like a whole practice session, I guess, instead of spending hours drawing one thing, I guess I would recommend trying to draw objects, just silhouettes of objects, and then trying to make the shape as interesting as possible. So, you can pretty much do this with anything. And throughout doing this process, you'll kind of realize things that maybe you shouldn't draw. It's nice to be able, drawing, you can draw anything, but should you really draw anything? Is the bigger question, especially when you're trying to create an interesting composition. And by drawing these silhouettes and refining that macro micro scale of the edges and figuring out the balance between that object and the negative space is how you're really going to be able to make a good composition in the end. I mean, we got to remember that as crazy, detailed, and insane Khan's illustrations are, you know, it's like I was saying in the beginning, it's like these pictures are really just a few values. Like you just have dark darks and bright brights. Like there's really, two or three shape groups that are actually working on each other here and like a lot of these images. So if you just ignore basically everything and you just look at this image for its shapes, you basically just have a bright set of shapes, a dark set of shapes, and you're just trying to figure out how to balance those. And obviously this whole image, like, yeah, it's built up of shapes, but like shapes isn't going to get you to be able to draw like this. Like you're not going to instantly be able to go to sleep at night and wake up the next morning and this guy has like years and years of experience. Like this dude's drawing all the time, tons of practice. So, it's obviously not, it's easier said than done, but hopefully you can understand my point here about shape language. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more stuff going on here than just shape language, but I really wanted to make a video about shape language because I think it's just something that like a lot of people just really don't talk about, and it's a significant factor in everything. Like it's the foundation of your illustration. Um, and I think especially if you haven't been thinking about it, you really should start thinking about it going into every illustration that you make. And some of the other things that make this image so good. Lighting is a huge factor, obviously. Like you have to have a really good idea of lighting because that's really what is actually going to make this picture look realistic in the end. You know, how are you going to get that sense of realism? It's all lighting essentially. Um, that's how you can get away with stylized realism, where obviously a lot of Khan's characters, they don't really look like realistic humans. Like they're more like anime type stylized faces, but somehow he's able to create these stylized faces and make them actually look like they're in real, believable environments. And yeah, that all just comes down to lighting pretty much. So that's a huge factor in this style. And then, of course, you have color theory, which is, in my opinion, probably the most difficult thing in illustration. Color can be really hard to get right. Um, it's not as important as lighting, I don't think, but it's what really adds like that extra level of aesthetic to your image, I guess. And if you're really good at color theory, you can do some really amazing things. But all these things, lighting, color, anatomy, things like that, like it's just things that you continuously have to practice. And I might make videos about that too, and other artists I've looked at and how they use those other elements. But yeah, I just really wanted to talk about how Kan Liu uses shape language because I think that this guy is like a perfect example of incredibly strong shape language and how to use it. So yeah, hopefully there wasn't too much yapping in this video, and hopefully people can understand it, and maybe this will help some people out there. But yeah,